Good evening, everyone. I'm Aurelia Nelson, and on behalf of the staff and the entire crew at the Salem Athenaeum, I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us for tonight's hybrid lecture with Thomas Forrest Kelly on Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, Then and Now. We hope you'll join us as well on October 18th for a magical evening with best-selling author Alice Hoffman. She will be launching her latest paperback book with us at the Cinema Salem. For those of you on Zoom audience tonight, we will keep an eye on the Q&A and assure you that we will do our best to make sure your questions get answered. Thomas Forrest Kelly is a Morton B. Knopfler Research Professor of Music at Harvard University and serves on the faculty of the Historical Performance Program at the Juilliard School. He is the author of Capturing Music, First Night's 5 Performance Premieres, and Early Music, A Very Short Introduction. His Benedettin chant was awarded the Otto Kinkeldy Award of the American Musicological. And he is a chevalier. See if I can get this right.
Never mind.
Chevalier de l'Ordre des Arts et Lettres of the French Republic and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Academy in Rome, and the Medieval Academy in America. We're thrilled to have him back at the Athenaeum. It's been over 4 years since you were last here. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming out. I gather that this is kind of a Renaissance moment. That it's been a tough couple of years, and I think the Athenaeum is. I may be wrong about this, but sort of getting in gear to go back to the kinds of program here and elsewhere that I'm sure people have enjoyed for many, many years. And I'm glad to be part of bringing things back. Thanks for coming out. I hope we don't infect each other, but I think we won't. We're all vaccinated and we're all civilized people here, aren't we?
We're boosted.
Anyhow, those of you, I don't know where the Zoomers are. Hello out there, Zoomers. Hello to people here in the Athenaeum. It's great to be here. I'd like to talk about a thing that's a particular sort of the way I like to approach music, which is not as necessarily a timeless work of art up on a pedestal in a museum, but something that's a sort of a living, breathing object designed by and for people, something that exists in its own place and time. Both of those ways of thinking about things are great. And what's sort of fun is when we think about what something was like when it was new rather than when it's old. And then we think about what we think about it in our world when it's old. And then we compare the two. We learn a lot about the differences between not just the way a piece of music or a piece of art was looked at, listened to, read, but also some things about ourselves in the world we live in, the world they live in. So as an example of that, I'd like to talk about what may be the most famous piece of music ever. Written by this guy. This is Beethoven, the monument. You know, he is the great monumental composer who writes the great monumental pieces. And if there's any piece by Beethoven that just about everybody knows, it's the Ninth Symphony. The Ninth Symphony is the piece that, as you know, has the tune. You remember the tune. If you don't remember, you certainly do remember the tune. Here's a place where the tune has already been played by the orchestra. It's already been sung by some people. And then it stops and it goes away and other stuff happens in the orchestra. And then everything sort of stops. And there's a moment where Beethoven, he puts you on edge and he lets you, you know it's about to happen, but he says, wait for it. The sound here is the best we can do. Imagine yourself in Symphony Hall. that tune. I don't know how many people here have heard a live performance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, probably everybody in the room. How many people here have performed in a performance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony? In the chorus or in the, did you conduct it? You're in the chorus. Yeah. Well, it's a piece that we all know, and it's known very, very well in our world. The tune has been used for everything. It's a Protestant hymn, joyful, joyful, we adore thee. I've heard it used to sell Fords, more new wagons, more new wagons. It's now the national, it's the anthem of the European Union, the official anthem of the European Union, that tune. And it also, so they say, is the reason the modern, well, not so modern anymore, compact disc is the size it is. When the Philips company and the Sony company were organizing the invention of this new optical recording device that was going to be on a disc, they said, well, how big should it be? And the Sony people, the Japanese people, for whom the Ninth Symphony is a great big iconic piece that gets performed every year as a New Year's event, the Japanese people said, we don't care how long it is, how big it is, as long as Beethoven's Ninth Symphony fits on one side of it. And that's the reason the compact disc is the size it is, or so they said. So it is, at least the tune, something that we know. But when we think a little bit about what Beethoven's people knew, after all, Beethoven didn't write it for us. He would be pleased, and maybe not as surprised as some composers, to know that we still care deeply about his music. But what his own contemporaries, those are the people for whom he wrote the music, what did they think about it? Well, they knew some things that we don't know. And when we think about some of those, it's sort of interesting. One of the things they knew, is that something that we also know, that this is the crazy symphony that includes vocal soloists and a chorus in the last movement. You're not supposed to do that in a symphony, but this one does. And in the last movement, we all know that now, but it was a big surprise then. Beethoven includes words from a poem by Germany's second most famous poet, Mr. Schiller. There's Mr. Schiller's Ode to Joy, probably something that all of Beethoven's audience knew. And the thing they knew about that Ode to Joy was something we don't think about, but maybe we should. It's a drinking song. And Beethoven selects words out of Schiller's Ode to Joy. He didn't select all the words, and he skipped ones that said, joy sparkles in these goblets, or let this foam spray to heaven, brethren, and that kind of thing. It's a rousing drinking song of a kind that was absolutely typical in the early 19th century. There was, in the early 19th century, founded at a university I'm associated with, an institution called the Harvard Glee Club, which was a bunch of gentlemen who got together, and actually they weren't supposed to probably, but you drink and you sing songs about women. That's Wine, Women in Song. There's an institution in Boston called the Handel and Haydn Society. There was a bunch of gentlemen who got together and drank and sang songs. It's that they too are a glee club. And there's an institution in London founded at the end of the 18th century called the Glee Club. They're a club established to sing songs that are called glees. Well, why is he getting into this? I thought this was a talk about Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Well, the thing is, they have those drinking songs of that kind are things that people understood very well. The theme song of the Glee Club in England was a song called the Anacreontic Song. And it has words like this. It's about people, gentlemen who appeal to Anacreon, that imaginary poet drinker of the Middle East, of ancient Greek times. And they say, will you be our patron? And he says, sure, I'll be your patron. And besides, I'll instruct you like me to entwine the myrtle of Venus with Bacchus's vine. So there's the myrtle of Venus, that is the lovely ladies, with Bacchus's vine, you know what that is, and we're singing a song about it. And the tune of the Anacreontic Song is one that you might recognize. I sing so beautiful. To Anacreon in heaven, as he sat in full glee, a few songs of harmony sent a petition that he there inspired. You get the impression? voice fiddle and flute, no longer be mute, and so on. Well, that anacreontic song was one that was known to at least one person, namely Mr. Francis Scott Key, who wrote a poem about the bombardment in Baltimore Harbor and whether through the smoke you could still see the flag flying. And it was designed to be sung here in to Anacreon in Heaven. So to the tune that we all know, the drinking song that we all know, we sing, oh, say, can you see? And we've been doing it ever since. So you might say that Beethoven took a drinking song and turned it into, that Mr. Francis Scott Key took a drinking song and turned it into the American national anthem, and that Beethoven took a drinking song and turned it into the world's national anthem. But this is all happening in a place and in a time in the month of May 1824 in the city of Vienna. Many of you may know Vienna better than I do, and maybe you've been there. But anyway, in 1824, no matter how you approached the city, you had to cross a great big open space called the Glacis. And that open space, even if you were approaching the imperial palace of the emperors of Austria and kings of Hungary, you had to pass this big open space, which was designed to be wider than the throw of a 17th century cannon. Because the Turks had besieged the Vienna almost within living memory. The Viennese were aware that they were the eastern outpost of Western civilization as they thought of it. The Turks didn't see it that way. But nevertheless, there's all this Turkish music. There's actually Turkish music in the Ninth Symphony. There's Turkish music. Whenever you hear cymbals and triangles and a bass drum in music by Haydn or Mozart or Beethoven, they're evoking the Janissary bands of the Turkish army. That little Mozart piano rondo, that's supposed to sound like a Turkish band also. So Turkish music, the idea that we are the outpost, and that open space is designed to make sure that you can't get a cannon within shooting distance of the interior of the center walls of the city without its being out in the open. It's a defensive measure. The center of the city is surrounded by, you can still see the arrowhead-shaped bastions. The medieval walls of the central city are there. There's the Glacis all around. The Danube flows across the top. And then there's another set of walls that you can't see out here that surround the suburbs that are really more toll gates than defensive things. And you can see in the center of the city, you can see it's a dense medieval city. You can see at the bottom the sort of harpsichord triangle-shaped footprint of the royal palace, the imperial palace, where the Emperor of Austria and a whole bunch of bureaucrats run a very large polyglot empire. And you can see right in the center, kind of like a spider in the middle of her web, the footprint of St. Stephen's Cathedral, the great big medieval Gothic cathedral that you can see from almost anywhere in the city, wherever you are. This is the view that Mozart had when he stuck his head out his apartment instead of composing the Marriage of Figaro, which is what he was supposed to be doing in that apartment. But wherever you are, the cathedral is a presence in the center of the city. It still looks kind of like that now. Still today, if you go to this place, it'll look like that, except that there's a subway entrance where this lady is standing. And there is usually a line of the characteristic 2-horse, 4-wheel fiacres that you can hire to take you around the city. They now have rubber tires on them, most of them, so they won't make as much noise and be so uncomfortable over the cobblestones. But the look is pretty much that of the early 19th century. Here's a painting of the Mailmarkt, one of the big open squares in Vienna. And on the right-hand side, partway up on the right, is the coffee house where Mozart used to play billiards and meet his friends. A lot of stuff has happened since this painting was painted. We might be able to tell something about this being a painting from the late 18th century by those two gentlemen who were casting shadows there. You can see their three-cornered hats, their knee breeches, and maybe their buckled shoes, of the kind that you could imagine George Washington wearing those clothes. But a lot of stuff has happened since then that the Viennese are very aware of. One is the American Revolution. It's a very long way away from Vienna, but everybody sat up and took notice. The idea that you can say, we're not interested in having a king anymore. Well, the Emperor of Austria noticed that, noticed it very well. And then long after that came the French Revolution, where not only do you say we're not going to have a king anymore, but we're going to cut his head off. So there was actually an awful lot of repression in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There were secret police, there were informers, there were limits on the press. There were all sorts of things that we would not like if we lived there then. So the idea of freedom, of individual liberty, the sort of Enlightenment ideals that were going around at the same time created a kind of conflict that some of us might recognize in our own modern politics, but that's a different lecture and I'm not going to give it. And then after that comes Napoleon Bonaparte, who has overrun all of Europe, taken over France, overrun all of Europe, including Vienna, insisted on marrying a member of the Austrian aristocracy, and impoverished Vienna. All of that has happened since this picture was painted, and after Napoleon finally is defeated, the representatives of all the powers of Europe gathered in Vienna at what was called the Congress of Vienna in 1815 to sort out the boundaries of post-Napoleonic Europe. And it's at the Congress of Vienna. Beethoven actually wrote a cantata for performance at the Congress of Vienna. It's called The Glorious Moment. It's far from his most glorious piece, but he was there. At the Congress of Vienna, they say that's the first time that gentlemen appeared in public in trousers that, how can I describe this? Trousers that go all the way down to the tops of their shoes, like the ones I'm wearing now. That's what everybody would have been seen on the street in 1850, which is not what those guys are wearing, which is why we know that an awful lot of stuff has happened between that picture and our moment of 1824. So Beethoven writes a symphony. We all know about symphonies, right? And we know something about symphonies, but the people who really knew about symphonies were the people who liked music and lived in Vienna at this time, because they had heard not only the 41 symphonies of Mozart and the 100 and who knows how many symphonies of Haydn, and so far 8 symphonies by Beethoven, and many, 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 many other symphonies by many, many, many other composers. So they knew how a symphony works. And the basic idea of a symphony is that it's a series of pieces of music that are played one after another to give a kind of a whole psychological effect. We call them movements, from the French word for how fast it goes. So, and we know how a symphony goes. The first movement should be lively, and the weightiest movement of the symphony, sort of lively up-tempo thing. And then after that, you have something, a second movement, something contemplative or sad or something or other. And we, in our wisdom, call it the slow movement. Then after you've done a fast movement, a slow movement, what do? Well, then you give people a sort of a 7th inning stretch. You have a kind of a dance movement or something. In Mozart's and Haydn's day, a minuet. And then you have an up-tempo finale that sends the audience away whistling, a kind of lighthearted thing. That's how a symphony works. So a symphony is supposed to, everybody says, is supposed to start loud and fast, because you need to call the audience to attention, because they're, peeling oranges and talking to each other and walking around. You want them to know the concert has started. So you play something really, oh, okay. So a symphony is supposed to start loud and fast, and a whole lot of symphonies do. That's sort of traditional. And there's even somebody who gives a recipe for how to write a symphony. It says, be sure and start loud and fast. Does anybody remember how Beethoven's symphony begins, this Ninth Symphony? It's the absolute opposite of that. It begins, you can't even tell whether it started or not. It begins with a kind of cosmic hum. It's not fast, it's not slow, it's not high, it's not low, it's not major, it's not minor, it might not even be there. And out of this background cosmic sound comes the smallest possible event. Bum. And then after a while, comes another one, ba-dum. And then another one, ba-dum. Okay. And then that happens again, and then they happen closer together in time. Ba-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum. And then it gets a little bit longer. Ba-ba-dum, ba-ba-dum, ba-ba-dum. And they kind of coalesce in the universe. So finally they assemble themselves into a tune. And you know where you are. But the way Beethoven does this, he gives us a composing lesson. He also says this is a cosmic piece, and it's going to be really long. I mean, I think we get all of that information from those few seconds that begin this symphony. Can't turn it in high. I'm sorry. Closer together. 3 notes. Okay. Now we're up and running. Whoops. We're doing it again. So, Beethoven gives a concert in which he performs his new symphony. He didn't call it a concert because the word concert in German was already reserved for what we call a concerto. So what we call a concert in English, in Vienna was called an academy. Beethoven gives an academy. You will give an academy, and an academy is what is a series of musical performances given for a paying audience in a place. What's interesting to me is some differences about how you give concerts. In Boston, we are fortunate to have one of the world's great symphony orchestras. They play in one of the world's great concert halls called Symphony Hall. They have a regular roster. They rehearse regularly together with all the same people, and they give a regular series of symphony concerts. And in Symphony Hall, there's a cartouche over the stage that has one word in it. Probably everybody here knows what that word is. What's that word? Beethoven is what it says over the stage of Symphony Hall. The symphonies of Beethoven are the cornerstone of Western concert music and always have been since Beethoven's day. And the size of a modern symphony orchestra is predicated on being able to play Beethoven's symphonies. Flutes, oboes, clarinets, bassoons, horns, trumpets, drums. Got that? You got plenty of strings, you're okay. You might need triangles and bass drum and every now and then. And yet, in Beethoven's Vienna, where Beethoven wrote symphonies, there was, and whose music is the cornerstone of our concert life, there was no concert hall, no symphonic concert hall, no regular symphony orchestra, no regular series of symphony concerts. Isn't that weird? I mean, we're in a place where Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven wrote their symphony. Well, that's the way it worked. If you were going to give an academy, it was a one-off thing. You had to find an orchestra. You had to get people to be in an orchestra. You had to compose the music, print the tickets, posters, organize a box office, all that sort of thing. And you had to find a place to do it. So one of Beethoven's first things, he had given academies before in various places around town. And this one, so one of the things you do is think about, well, where am I going to give this concert? When am I going to do it? What hall might be free? How much would it cost me? Can I do that? So he looked into some of the various places that you might give an academy in Vienna. And some of them include the big ballroom in the Imperial Palace. Here fitted out for an opera performance under Maria Theresia, but it could be used for various other things. And when it was not used for other things, you could hire. Another possibility also used for concerts was the indoor riding ring attached to the Imperial Palace. Here being used for a carousel. We use the word, carousel means a military display of horsemanship to the accompaniment of music, named for the Place du Carrousel in front of the Louvre in Paris. And we use the word carousel also for horses moving in patterns to music, but the horses tend to be wooden and go around in a circle. And anyway, so here was a carousel actually with carriages being given in the indoor riding ring. You can still go there. It's now called the Spanish Riding School, and you can see demonstrations of the amazing La Pizza stallions doing their dressage. That's another possibility for a very large-scale concert. Other possibilities include the Burgtheater. This building on the building with the dome is the outside of the indoor riding ring. And to the right of that, with the curved window over the door, is what's called the Burgtheater, the theater attached to the palace, which was used as an opera house some of the time and for spoken theater some of the time. Here it's being used for a play, and it looks like a really boring play. I mean, there are not many people there, and the ones who were there aren't paying much attention. And the guy giving the speech, the actor giving the speech at the base of the statue, looks like he's bored. You can tell, like most Viennese theaters, that the floor is divided up into tourist and business class, with business class in the back. That we can't quite see, but if you could see the picture better, you would see the scrolls of double basses here. The orchestra had been there to play an overture, and they'll be back to play between the acts, but now they're out having a couple of beers down the street. That's one possibility. Another possibility, one that Beethoven was really interested in, is this here, the Theater an der Wien, the theater built along the stream called the Wien or Wieden that flows into the Danube. It's now covered over by market stalls and parking lots, but it's still there. And this theater was built in the very early 19th century with the proceeds of Mozart's magic flute. Sort of. I mean, Mr. Emanuel Schikaneder commissioned the magic flute from Mozart for his company that liked to do kind of magic operas. He had a magic bassoon opera and a magic everything you can think of. And he was particularly interested, Schikaneder, in things with lots of stage tricks. And the magic flute has the Queen of the Night appearing in the sky, and has boys coming down in balloons and fire trials, but all kinds of amazing stuff happening. Schikaneder took the role of Papageno, who plays the panpipes. You remember? The Papageno, the bird catcher. Anyhow, with the proceeds from the magic flute, Mr. Schikaneder built this theater, the Theater an der Wien. Mozart never lived to see it finished, but I think of it, at least in part, as Mozart's theater, because it was proceeds from the magic flute that paid at least for part of it. It was a very big theater with of course, possibilities for all sorts of things, including horses on stage, fountains on stage. You could have people swimming in shows and so forth. The building is still there in Vienna. If you go, it's wrapped up in this 19th century facade. And when I went by, they were playing Phantom of the Opera. Yeah. Of course, they wanted me to think of Andrew Lloyd Webber, but the phantoms I was thinking of were, one, Beethoven's Fidelio, which was given its premiere here, and Mozart's Magic Flute. It's a very historic place, of course, and Beethoven had once actually lived in an apartment in the buildings associated with this theater. So he tried to get this, and things didn't work out because they said, sure, but you'll be using our singers, our soloists, and our conductor, and our chorus, and our orchestra. And he said, well, actually, I have some of my own people in mind. They couldn't come to terms, so he didn't do that. So the place he ultimately settled on was this thing. This is its official name is the Royal Imperial Court Theater next to the gate that leads to the province of Carinthia. I'm not kidding you, that's what its name is, called the Kärntnerfurt Theater for short. And it's the opera house. It was what was being used for the performance of opera at the time. And on nights when there wasn't an opera, you could hire it, which Beethoven did. It's a big theater, also divided up into economy and business, with a great many boxes and so forth. And it's in this place that Mr. Beethoven gave his academy in May of 1824. You have to do a lot of things, not only print the tickets and find the people. There is an orchestra in the theater that plays for the opera. He needed an orchestra about twice that size, so he recruited as many amateurs again. There's a small chorus in the theater, and he doubled it using people he would volunteer to help him out. Vocal soloists, some of them opera singers from here, but mostly people he knew. He had to assemble his personnel. He also had to write the music and cause the music to be copied out. This is one of the original performing parts for the Ninth Symphony, in the hand of a professional music copyist, but with corrections by Beethoven. Beethoven sometimes gets really mad at the music copyists. That's a whole nother story. And you have to print the posters. Here's a poster for Beethoven's concert, Beethoven's Academy. And what it says is, a Grand Musical Academy by Herr Ludwig van Beethoven, which tomorrow, the 7th of May, 1824, in the Royal Imperial Court Theater next to the Corinthia Gate, I told you, will be given. Abgehalten wird. This is the way German works. And it says, die dabei vorkommenden Musikstücke sind die neuesten Werke des Herrn Ludwig van Beethoven. The pieces to be performed are the very latest works of Mr. Beethoven. That's a little bit of media hype. That's not quite true, but he wanted it to be true. And in that, there's another big difference between them and us. That is, if we go to a concert, I think we prefer to go to music that we know. If I say to you, I've got 2 tickets here to the Mozart Requiem, and I have 2 tickets here to Eloise Stiggins's new Requiem, which pair do you want? Most of the people I know would pick these because they know it, they like it, and they don't want to take a chance. But in Beethoven's day, if it's new, you much prefer it to something that's already been performed. Now, why is that? I think it's at least in part because people were composing in a style that people understood. In the same way that we can't wait for another episode of The Crown to come out, or we'd like to read another Agatha Christie, or something, or another sitcom, another Seinfeld, because we already know what it is. We know what it is, we know how it works, we know we like it, and we want another one. So if you're writing music in a style that people understand, then you look forward to some more. That's yet another lecture, which is about what's the problem with modern music, but this is not that talk, but it is a big difference between them and us. And the pieces are, first, a grand overture. This is not really a new piece. This is a piece, we now call it the Consecration of the House Overture, that Beethoven had composed a few years earlier for the reopening of the refurbished, one of the refurbished suburban theaters called the Theater in der Leopoldstadt. Secondly, 3 grand hymns with solo and chorus voices. Well, what's that? Well, what that actually is a major portion of the piece that we now call the Missa Solemnis. Great, huge mass in Latin for solo voices, choir, and orchestra that Beethoven had composed a little bit before. But because everything is subject to censorship, you have to put in your program to the censors. And the censors say, no, 1,000 times no. We are a devout Catholic country. We do not perform church music in theaters for money. No. So he says, well, there's a lot of negotiations, and we have conversations in Beethoven's conversation books. You know that by now Beethoven was completely deaf. He couldn't hear anything at all. And it's the saddest thing you can imagine for a composer, for a musician. But it has one side benefit for us in that he carried on all his conversations in little books. You went and wrote in the book "Good morning, Mr. Beethoven." And he said, "Get out of here, Kelly. I haven't got time for you or any other Harvard professor or anybody else. I'm busy with my symphony," or whatever he said. We don't have that part. We have only the part that people wrote to Beethoven, and he spoke his answers. But you can usually tell how the conversation was going, and it tells you all sorts of things about Beethoven's daily life and what he's thinking and what he's doing that are really interesting. Anyhow, we have things in his conversation books about negotiations with the censors for this. And the final deal that was cut was, well, if we call them grand hymns, and we don't say it's part of my big new mass, can we get away with it? Well, okay, you're Beethoven, you're a famous composer. All right, just this once. So he got to do that, but he had to call it 3 grand hymns. And then third, a grand symphony with, in the finale, entering solo and choral voices on Schiller's song To Joy. That's us, that's our symphony. So it's an overture, the Missa Solemnis and the Ninth Symphony. That's a lot of music. He had given even longer concerts than that. And then he goes on to say, the solo voices will be sung by Demoiselle Sontag and Unter with Herr Heitzinger and Seifeld, Herr Schuppanzig, the great Ignaz Schuppan. I wish we had time to go into who all these singers were. The soprano soloist was 18 years old and already a huge opera star in Vienna and ended up conquering the whole world. The alto, Caroline Unger, was 21 years old. The bass sang on the strength of one rehearsal because the previous bass quit because he said the music was too high. There are a lot of interesting things about the people involved. Schuppanzig, his great big violinist, Beethoven's old friend who was just back from Russia. Beethoven called him my Lord Falstaff, probably partly because of his appearance and partly maybe because of his potatory prowess. Anyhow, Schuppanzig was back and he led the orchestra. And then it says, Herr Ludwig van Beethoven himself will take part in the leading of the whole thing. That also is a way to try to sell tickets. You get to see Beethoven. What he really did was stand by Mr. Umlauf's elbow and give him indications of the tempos. It was far too late for Beethoven to be conducting. He had learned his lesson. He tried conducting a couple of times previously and got himself completely off the track. And orchestras that had to stop. So he knew better by now. Then it said, the usual prices, no free passes, beginning at 7 o'clock in the evening. So that's the poster. And Beethoven may have, Beethoven had a lot to do to get ready for this concert. This is a drawing made of Beethoven in May of 1824. That is the moment of this concert. And what I find interesting is the fact that this drawing may actually show Beethoven's new concert haircut. I'm not sure of that, but in the conversation books after the concert, Beethoven and his nephew Karl and Ignaz Schuppanzig went to dinner in the Prater, in the big garden where there were outdoor restaurants. And Beethoven accused them of cheating him. We didn't make nearly as much money as I wanted and so forth. But somewhere in the conversation book, his nephew Karl writes, my Lord Falstaff praises the master who cut your hair. This may be Beethoven's concert haircut, and I don't know, does it matter? It doesn't really matter to the Ninth Symphony, except that I find it touching that even Beethoven goes and spiffs himself up a little bit for his concert. And even Beethoven has to get a haircut. So he presents us with this symphony. It begins, as we already know, it has 4 movements like a symphony is sort of supposed to, but he makes a couple of very big changes. We've already heard one, that is the way he begins the first movement is really, really spooky and not the way you normally begin. And then you usually have a slow movement followed by a minuet. What Beethoven does is swap those 2 interior movements so that the minuet, only now it's not a minuet, he speeds it up so fast, he calls it a joke. And it's a scherzo, it's called, but it's really a fast minuet. Instead of going 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, it goes 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. But it's related to a minuet. And then the slow movement comes here. And then at the end comes what should be the lighthearted giveaway movement. It's far longer than the other three movements put together. So he's really changing the shape of the symphony in large ways and in small ways. The Scherzo is the piece that comes next. Probably nobody here is old enough to remember the Huntley-Brinkley report. So you won't know the funny beginning of the Scherzo with the big fake out from the kettle drums, which is really kind of a joke. And a little fugue. And so on. Then comes the beautiful, I think it's beautiful. A lot of people think of the slow movement of the Ninth Symphony as being kind of like New Jersey. You know, New Jersey is what keeps you from getting to Philadelphia faster. And everybody wants to get to the slow, to the tune. Well, don't take that attitude. First of all, New Jersey is very nice. My wife Peggy sitting right back there is from New Jersey. But it's also true that it's a very, very, very beautiful movement. It begins with a kind of a halo of woodwinds, and then the strings play a gorgeous slow theme, one phrase at a time. And at the end of each phrase, the woodwinds play a little echo to it. It's sort of complicated. It gets to be a sort of double variations and something very beautiful. It begins with these woodwinds, and then the gorgeous slow theme played in the strings. And that movement goes beautifully sailing off into the sunset. And then what on earth? Wow, what on earth is that? Amazing explosion. Well, I think that most of Beethoven's audience hearing that beginning for the last movement will have said, oh, I know what that is. That's a bass rage recitative, right? You know what I mean? Well, let me back up and sort of give you an idea of what I mean. Everybody, not everybody, but people who listen to music of this kind spent most of the time, because the music that was mostly available was opera. So you go to the opera, you go to a Mozart opera or any kind of opera, you remember that it's an alternation between the harpsichord plays a chord and somebody goes da 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 da, plink, plink, and then the orchestra plays an aria. So it might be somebody says, to arms, the enemy is coming, and then the orchestra strikes up a really loud thing, and the trumpet plays, and somebody says, to arms, and goes off stage to a huge applause, and then the harpsichord plays again, and somebody says something else. So the hero, the heroine says, my husband has left me, I'm here, I am alone in this foreign country, I weep, I pine. Then the orchestra starts playing really sad music, and she comes down stage and sings a very, very sad, beautiful aria. She goes off, we clap, and the harpsichord plays again, somebody else. That's the way it works. That's the way opera works, and it's designed not to be realistic, but to move from one moment where a person feels a certain strong emotion and expresses it in music, to another moment where another person feels another strong emotion and expresses it in music. And in between, so the recitatives are kind of the movie, and the arias are the freeze frame, where you stop and study how a person would feel in this situation, and you hear it in music. That's the point of the stupid opera plots. If you want realism, go downtown and look at the witch people. But if you want beautiful emotional stuff, that's what it's about. But every now and then, a character feels more than one emotion at a time and feels such an overflow of emotion that composers save a particular kind of opera music for that kind of moment, and it's called an accompanied recitative. That is, you talk kind of like the recitative is delivered kind of in spoken rhythm, whereas the aria repeats the same words over and over and over. But instead of being accompanied just by a harpsichord, it's accompanied by the whole orchestra. And it's always a moment of strong emotion. But and when you have one emotion immediately after another, it's hard to write an aria because an aria usually is about one thing. So when somebody feels a lot of different things, you use an accompanied recitative. And when the person is angry, it's always a bass. I don't know why, but it always is. I don't know if you know Handel's Messiah, but you know there's a famous accompanied recitative that goes, "Thus saith the Lord of hosts, yet once a little while and I will share." That's a bass rage recitative, that kind of thing. My favorite one is not by Beethoven, but it's one that Beethoven knew. It's by George Frederick Handel, and it's from his charming little opera called Acis and Galatea. It's you talk about stupid opera plots. The first half of it is, well, the shepherd Acis has fallen in love with the divine and immortal Galatea. That's a problem. And he comes on and says, "Has anybody seen Galatea?" And then he sings a beautiful aria longing for Galatea. He goes off to look for her. She comes on and says, "Has anybody seen Acis?" And then she sings a song about as when the dove laments her love, and she goes off. Then he comes on and sings another one about missing Galatea. He comes on and sings another one of whoever it is, they take turns singing. And at the end of the first act, they come on at the same time and sing a duet called Happy, Happy We, and that's the end of the first half. That's all that happened, but the music is so beautiful. And in the second half, they trot out the plot in the form of the evil giant Polyphemus. And this is the problem. He also is in love with Galatea. And he's also 10 feet tall and has one eye in the middle of his forehead and smells bad and all sorts of things. And so he introduces himself, saying how he feels and describing himself. He says, "I melt." That's because he's in love. "I rage," because somebody else. And then he says, "I burn." That is one emotion right after another. Then he explains why he feels all those things. "The feeble God has stabbed me to the heart." That is, little Cupid has wounded great big me in the heart. And then, because the role of Polyphemus is played by a normal human being rather than an 8-foot tall giant with one eye in the middle of it, he has to explain that he's big. So he says, "I use a whole pine tree for my walking stick. Thou trusty pine, drop of my godlike steps, I lay thee by." And then he says, "Bring me 100 reeds of decent growth to make a pipe." He doesn't mean a pipe to smoke. He means the little pan pipes like Papageno plays. "But I need 100 great big reeds to make a pipe for my capacious mouth, so that in charming accents let me breathe sweet Galatea's beauty and my love." The point of all of that is it's a very cool piece. And then, of course, what happens is he ends up smashing Acis flat with a rock and killing him. In the beautiful lamenting scene, and at the end, Galatea turns Acis into an ever-flowing fountain. She says, "Be thou immortal, if thou be not mine." And it's very beautiful music. Anyway, here's Polyphemus appearing on stage in a bass rage recitative, whose point, at least at the beginning, is that he changes moods every couple of seconds. But also, and Why? Well, then he goes on and sings a little song playing his panpipe. So ready, and he likens her to a baby goat. Well, this is a statue of Polyphemus looking down with jealousy on Acis and Galatea, from the Medici fountain in the gardens of the Luxembourg Palace in Paris. So next time you go, it's on the side of the palace. Think of that music. Think of that guy singing, that guy up there singing that. So that's, you remember how they went bluster in the orchestra, and then one person in the bass register says, "I rage." Well, if you listen again to the beginning of the last movement, it sounds kind of familiar. I rage. Change of mood. What's this? Wait. That's the music from the beginning of the first movement. You can't do that in symphony. Oops. And that's the Scherzo. Oh no. There's that beautiful thing from the slow movement. No, I want something more. How about something like yes. So now we know where we're going. We have a classic recitative ending. Clink, clink, and then we have the aria. The double basses play yada da 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 da. It goes on and on and on and on and on. There are great big variations in the orchestra, and then in case somebody wandered in from the Turkish army and didn't know what a bass rage recitative was, they do it again, and this time a bass stands up and says what we've already heard the orchestra say. The orchestra has said, "Oh, friends, not these sounds, not that first movement, not that second movement, not that third movement. They were all great, but sounds of joy." He says that just in case you missed it. And then we get into we all sing the song, and you can sing in your heart or sing out loud when we get to it. This is clarinet. And then it goes on and on. Well, It's a piece that we think we know, but the way we know it is not the way Beethoven's audience knew it. As you, I hope you see, there's quite a number of things that they understood very clearly. And there are quite a number of things in their lives, the way they dealt with and listened to music that are very different from the way we do. We would not want to trade what we have, which is the ability to listen to all the music from all times at any time we want to, day or night, for what they had, which was an ability to concentrate on the music of their own time and then know it really well. But when we compare the two things, I think we learn an awful lot about the music we're interested in, and also, I think, quite a lot about ourselves. So I think I'll stop there and see if anybody has any complaints or questions or something. Thank you for coming.
Question. In the early 1800s, how did this music all get recorded? You've got all the parts for all the instruments, and how did you get them? You don't have copies. How did you get them for all the instrumentalists, and how did you all preserve?
You write it in a score. On a score is a page that has a line for every instrument and every voice. So it only has like 4 measures. You know, it's only about, depending on how fast the music's going, a few seconds of music. And you have a big thick score, and then you hire a music copyist. You say, I want you to go across the top line, that's the flute part, and copy everything you see on the front, on the top line, put it on one piece of paper, and more if you need to, and hand that to the first flute player. Then you go down the second line, and that's the second flute, and so on. You go all the way down. And then once you've made one copy of the first violin part, you say, I need 8 of those because there's going to be 16 first violins. So you can make 7 more copies. It's a very laborious process.
That was expensive.
Yes, it was. That's why Beethoven was worried about breaking even on concerts like this. It's a very good point. Thank you. It's a big expense.
So what was the New York Times review of the concert?
The New York Times wasn't there yet, but one of the reasons actually I chose to teach this piece for many years in a big undergraduate music appreciation course I taught at Harvard, instead of the 5th Symphony, which in a way is easier to teach and understand, is that at the time of the 5th Symphony, there was no musical journalism at all. And by 1824, we have music journals, people publishing things, and we do have reviews for the 9th Symphony. And what they say is sort of what you might expect. People have huge respect for Beethoven. People say, this is probably a really cool piece. We better listen to it some more because it's not like anything we've ever heard before. And they also note that it was probably not a great performance. They say things like, the winds did very bravely. And given that there were sort of 2 rehearsals, only 2 rehearsals with everybody there for the 9th Symphony, the Boston Symphony Orchestra can do that. But they played it 100 times and they played really hard music. This is way harder than most of the people had ever played before because they were used to going choop, 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 choop in the opera house. So it probably was not what we would consider a great performance, but it was the best performance the 9th Symphony had ever had to date. Because it was the only one. Yes, ma'am.
So how does that evolve into what we know now? If it had been such a difficult beginning, how many performances does it take for this to become?
Well, it takes, yeah, it's a good point. But how long does it take for it to become iconic and also to sound like we're used to? One thing is that it's only about 10 years later in Paris that there begins to be a professional standing orchestra. The guy who directed the Paris Opera said, let's use the Conservatory Hall on Sundays when we're not playing operas. Let's organize an orchestra and we're going to practice a lot and we're going to give concerts and we're going to play the Beethoven symphonies. Then Mendelssohn in Leipzig and some other places, there began to be professional orchestras giving concerts of orchestral music for a paying bourgeois audience. It's getting out of the royal palace and into the streets of the town that begins to make it possible to have this concept of having an orchestra that people will pay to go here and that the musicians get paid to perform in. That hadn't existed except in opera houses, which was a different kind of world. And this is just before that movement gets started.
So everybody was kind of hearing it for the first time. You had orchestras that had never heard it played.
That's
before,
right.
so everyone was being reintroduced to it.
Right, and who was it? If you sing in the Ninth Symphony, you know that it lies really, 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 really high. For all the voices, it's really hard because it stays so high. I think Beethoven knew that. He changed only one note, and that was for the bass, who thought it was. He changed one note, and you can see it in the score. There's another possibility, and he quit anyway. You go. But all the other people, he said to Carolina Unger, the alto, he said, "Just practice it; the note will come." I think he knew. People say, "How could Beethoven do this when he was deaf?" He had 50 years of experience listening to, composing, and playing music, and things stick in your mind. You know how sometimes you're whistling something in the afternoon and you don't know where it came from. It's actually something you heard on the radio in the morning. And very often you whistle it in the same key you heard it in the radio, but you haven't thought about it anywhere in between. Where was that music between the time you heard it on the radio and the time you whistled it in the afternoon? It was in there somewhere. And if you can do that, suppose you put your active concentration on it, and suppose you're Beethoven, I imagine that he could. I don't have any of the doubts that some people have about his judgment in this symphony. I think he knew exactly what he was doing. Yes, ma'am.
So what was the next time it was performed? I mean, it's hard for me to imagine having heard it once and being able to really take it in. And say, well, I really want to hear that again.
Yeah.
And so
he actually gave us a second performance of this Academy. But it was a beautiful day and hardly anybody came because they were all out in the park. And the imperial family had already left for their summer vacation. Can you imagine? And it was 15 years or so before it was performed in Paris, before they felt they were up to it. There were a couple of performances in some other German cities, but not again in Vienna for a pretty long time. Yes, you had a question?
This is there's a couple from the audience.
Okay,
and,
people.
Yeah.
Zoomers.
The Zoomers, yes. So one of them asked on what you were just talking about. Is it the case that those who later picked up the Ninth had a sense of what we think of its greatness versus just picking it up because it had been done before?
Gosh, I mean, you would have to ask the people who did that what their motivation was. I don't know. But it didn't take long, at least in some places, for Beethoven's symphonies to become really iconic. Paris, which sort of took over as the major music city of the world. London was a major music city, and they cared deeply about Beethoven. And in fact, he sold the symphony twice, once to a Viennese publisher, and again, without either one knowing about the other, to the Philharmonic Society of London. It was a while, though, before they performed it or anybody else did. But Beethoven was, even in his lifetime, a very famous composer. So I'm sure people would have tried, but they probably took a look at it, as most symphony orchestras nowadays do, and said, look, a big chorus and 4 opera singers singing higher than any, we can't do, let's wait a while on that one, I imagine. People wanted to do it and ultimately got around to it. And of course, it became the Mount Everest of concert music, and still is in a lot of ways.
And one other question from a different person in the audience is, what is it in particular about Beethoven that makes you such a fan, and is he your favorite composer?
What is it about Beethoven that makes me a fan? It's his music. That's what makes me such a fan. I really like his music. But he is my favorite composer when I'm listening to him. But it's one of those questions like, is it true that Beethoven is a greater composer than Bach? I refuse to answer that question because there's a whole lot of great people, and I'm so, I don't know, I'm so flighty that my opinion changes from moment to moment. Right now, it's Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Good. Well, yeah, yes, sir.
About a year and a half ago, I think it was, there was a public performance of Beethoven's Ninth at the Heck Show. In fact, it was the first first thing going on there since COVID had started. And the music was the music, I think it was Handel and Haydn Society. But the translation of the Ode to Joy was really strange. It was kind of feminist, anti-racist. And it didn't seem to bear a whole lot of resemblance to the original German.
It's very hard. Schiller writes it as though it were a song being sung by a bunch of gentlemen about ladies and about drinking as well as about joy in general. And nowadays, when Schiller says, alle Menschen werden Brüder, we're not allowed to say that. We have to say all humans should be siblings or something like that.
Yeah.
And for some people, it doesn't have the same ring. It depends on whether you want to be respectful. I don't mean disrespectful, respectful of the time and place and the attitudes that people had, and let them leave them alone. They were doing fine for 1824, but you would not do. I don't think Mr. Schiller would write that poem today.
But it was interesting.
Yeah, sure. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is great to be back at the Athenaeum. I'm sure you agree about that, and I'm very glad for the invitation and very glad that you all came and that the people out there on their couches also came. Thank you very much.